There was nothing unusual about the way the morning started in Clarksburg, West Virginia, at least not to anyone who did not know what to look for. The sky above the low hills was the pale grey of late October, the kind of cold that settles in before the first frost, and the parking lot of the Clarksburg Memorial Chapel held perhaps 30 vehicles when Deputy Carl Hennessy arrived just after 9 in the morning. He had not planned to stay long. He had come because his dispatcher had called to say that a disturbance had been reported at a child's funeral, and that whoever had called it in had mentioned a dog that would not leave the coffin. Hennessy had assumed it was a grieving family pet, and nothing more. He pulled his cruiser to the edge of the lot and stepped out into the cold air, and that was when he heard it. Not barking exactly, but something lower, more deliberate, a sound he recognized from years of working alongside his department's K9 unit, a sound that trained handlers described as a focused vocalization, the kind a dog makes when it has found something and will not be moved from it. He followed the sound inside. The chapel was a modest building with dark wood pews and thick carpet that muffled footsteps, and the small room where the visitation was being held smelled of cut carnations and candle wax. The coffin at the front was white and small, the kind that no one in the funeral industry ever wants to have to use. A placard near the entrance identified the deceased as Emma Grace Calloway, aged 9, killed in a car accident 11 days prior on Route 50 outside of town. A photograph beside the placard showed a dark-haired girl with a gap-toothed smile holding a yellow ribbon at what appeared to be a county fair. Standing beside the closed lower half of the coffin, his broad head pressed against the side of it and his body absolutely still, was a large Belgian Malinois named Ranger. Hennessy stopped at the doorway and studied the dog for a moment before he looked for the family. Emma's mother, Diane Calloway, sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the room. She was a slight woman in her early 30s who looked as though she had not slept more than a few hours in days. Beside her sat a man Hennessy did not recognize, older, heavy-set, wearing a dark jacket that did not quite fit him, and he was the one who had reportedly complained about the dog. Hennessy learned within the first few minutes of speaking with the funeral director that the man was Diane's estranged brother-in-law, Gary Calloway, and that he had arrived that morning demanding that Ranger be removed from the premises because his presence was, in Gary's words, disrespectful. Diane had refused. Gary had called the non-emergency line. And now here was Hennessy, standing in a doorway watching a dog press himself against the side of a child's coffin with the focused stillness of an animal that had been trained to alert and had not yet been told to stand down. Ranger had belonged to Emma. That part was not in question. Diane had explained it to the funeral director the previous afternoon when she had asked, quietly and with considerable apology, whether she might be allowed to bring the dog for the visitation. Ranger had been with Emma since she was 5 years old, a retired personal protection dog rehomed through a non-profit that matched trained animals with families in rural areas where emergency services could take 20 minutes or more to arrive. Emma had been his whole world, the funeral director said, repeating what Diane had told him. He had been sleeping beside her bed the night of the accident. He had waited at the door for 3 days before Diane could bring herself to tell him, in whatever way a person tells a dog, that Emma was not coming back. And yet, when Diane had brought Ranger to the chapel that morning, and he had walked to the coffin and placed himself against it, something in his behavior had shifted from grief into something else, something purposeful. Something that a person who had spent enough time around trained working dogs would recognize as distinct from mourning. Hennessy had spent 11 years with the Harrison County Sheriff's Department before moving to Clarksburg PD, and 4 of those years had been in a joint K9 program with the State Patrol. He knew what a grieving dog looked like. He had seen it. An animal in grief is unfocused, restless, searching. Ranger was none of those things. Ranger was planted, his weight was forward, his nose was moving in slow, controlled sweeps along the seam of the coffin lid, and every 30 seconds or so he would lift his head and look directly at whoever was nearest, hold that look for a beat, and then return to the seam. It was the most disciplined, alert behavior Hennessy had seen outside of a K9 demonstration, and it was coming from a dog standing next to a closed child's coffin at a visitation in a small-town funeral home on a Tuesday morning in October. He stepped further into the room and asked Gary Calloway, politely, to wait outside for a few minutes. Gary did not take that well. He said that this was a family matter and that the dog was upsetting people, and that if the police were not going to remove it, then they should leave as well. Hennessy told him, in the even tone that 11 years in law enforcement tends to produce, that he appreciated Gary's patience, and that he would like 5 minutes alone with Mrs. Calloway and the funeral director before anyone made any decisions. Gary stood up and walked out, with the stiff posture of a man who expected to be obeyed and was not accustomed to waiting. When he was gone, Hennessy walked slowly to the front of the room and crouched down beside Ranger, keeping his hands loose and his body angled sideways, the way anyone trained around working dogs learns to approach an alert animal. He studied the coffin lid. Then he looked at Diane Calloway and asked her, as carefully as he knew how, when the coffin had been sealed and whether she had been present when it was. Diane looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that she had not. She said the funeral home had handled everything. She said she had been told Emma was not in a condition to be viewed, and that it would be better for her to remember her daughter the way she was. She said she had trusted them completely and had not thought to question any of it. Her voice was steady, but her hands had stopped being folded and were gripping each other tightly in her lap. Ranger had not moved. Hennessy stood up slowly and turned to face the funeral director, a thin, soft-spoken man named Gerald Pratt, who had run the chapel for over 20 years. He asked Pratt, in a tone that left no room for deflection, whether there was any reason the coffin could not be opened. Pratt began to explain that it was sealed per standard protocol when the deceased's condition warranted it, and that reopening it would require authorization, and that he was not certain this was the appropriate time or place for such a conversation. Hennessy told him that he understood all of that, and that he was not asking him to do anything yet, and that what he was asking was whether Pratt had personally confirmed the identity of the remains before the coffin was sealed. Pratt's answer, after a pause that lasted just a beat too long, was that the remains had been transferred from the county medical examiner's office and that he had processed the paperwork as received. Hennessy asked whether he had made a visual confirmation. Pratt said the condition of the remains had not permitted it. Hennessy asked who had told him that. Pratt said it had come from the intake form. Hennessy asked who had signed the intake form. Pratt went to his office to check. While Pratt was gone, Hennessy knelt again beside Ranger and looked at the dog carefully. Ranger was still working the seam of the lid with that slow, methodical focus, and there was something in the pattern of it that Hennessy found himself unable to set aside. Working dogs trained in search and rescue or cadaver detection do not generalize their alerts. They signal what they have found, or they signal the absence of what they were told to find, and those two things look different to someone who has been trained to read them. What Ranger was doing did not look like a dog that had found his person and was mourning her. It looked like a dog that had been brought to find his person and was signaling that she was not there. Hennessy was aware that this was an extraordinary thought to have standing in a funeral home on a Tuesday morning, and he was also aware that he had been a deputy long enough to know that extraordinary thoughts sometimes turn out to be correct, and that the cost of ignoring them is paid by someone else. Pratt returned with a folder. The intake form had been signed by a technician from the county medical examiner's office named Dale Ferris. Hennessy recognized the name. Ferris had been part of a quiet internal review at the ME's office 2 years earlier, involving mislabeled evidence in a DUI fatality case. Nothing had been formally substantiated at the time, but the name had stayed with Hennessy the way certain names do. He asked Pratt to step back, took out his radio and called his sergeant. He explained the situation in measured terms. He said he was not making an accusation, but that he had probable cause to request a welfare check on the identification of remains, and that he needed a supervisor, and ideally someone from the ME's office present before any further steps were taken. His sergeant, a pragmatic woman named Linda Oakes, who had seen enough in 22 years to take unusual requests seriously, told him she would be there in 15 minutes. Gary Calloway had come back inside by then and was standing near the entrance with his arms crossed, watching. Hennessy noticed that Gary's attention kept moving to the coffin and then away from it, the way a person's eyes move when they are trying not to look at something that concerns them. He filed that observation away and said nothing. Diane had not moved from her seat. She was watching Ranger with an expression that had slowly shifted over the past 20 minutes from grief into something more complicated, something that sat at the intersection of hope and terror. The look of a woman who was beginning to understand that the question she had been afraid to ask might have an answer she had not allowed herself to consider. Sergeant Oakes arrived at 9:47. She took one look at Ranger, spoke quietly with Hennessy for 2 minutes, and then asked Gerald Pratt to place a call to the county medical examiner's office and request an immediate records review of the Emma Calloway transfer. While Pratt made that call, Oakes stepped outside with Gary Calloway. The conversation was brief. When she came back inside, her expression had changed in the way that Hennessy had learned to read over the years, the look of a supervisor who has just been handed a problem that is no longer routine. She told Hennessy that Gary Calloway had admitted he had spoken by phone to Dale Ferris the week before, and that he had a financial dispute with Diane over Emma's life insurance policy, the beneficiary of which had been changed by Emma's father before his death 2 years prior, and that Gary had stood to receive nothing under the current terms of the policy if Emma had survived to adulthood. She said she had called the state police. What the state police investigation confirmed over the following 72 hours was something that the small city of Clarksburg would not fully absorb for weeks afterward. Emma Calloway had not died in the accident on Route 50. She had been injured, seriously, but she had been stabilized at Ruby Memorial Hospital in Morgantown, and at some point during the transfer of paperwork through the county system, her status had been falsified. The remains in the white coffin belonged to an unidentified individual whose case had been misrouted through the same office. Emma was alive. She had been transferred to a long-term care facility in Charleston under an administrative error that had gone undetected because no one had looked closely enough, and because her mother had been too deep in grief to question the paperwork she had been handed by people she trusted. Dale Ferris was taken into custody on the 3rd day. Gary Calloway was arrested the following morning on charges of fraud and conspiracy. The full scope of what they had arranged and what they had intended became a matter for the courts. Diane Calloway drove to Charleston that same afternoon, and she brought Ranger with her. Emma was unconscious, but stable, and the neurologist on her case said that her prognosis, now that she was receiving appropriate care, was cautiously hopeful. When Ranger was brought into the room and placed near the bed, he stopped alerting. He lay down beside the bed with his chin on his forepaws and exhaled a long, slow breath, the way a dog does when it has finally finished a task it was given and has been waiting a long time to complete. Emma opened her eyes for the first time in 11 days, 3 hours later. There was no ceremony in the immediate aftermath. Diane did not leave Emma's side for 2 weeks, and Ranger was permitted to stay in the room under a special arrangement made by the hospital's patient services coordinator, a quiet act of institutional grace that went largely unnoticed but meant everything to the people it concerned. The investigation into the county medical examiner's office expanded over the following months and ultimately led to a full audit that uncovered 3 additional cases of administrative misconduct, none as serious as Emma's, but all consequential. Ferris entered a guilty plea in February. Gary Calloway's trial was set for the spring. Emma came home in March. She walked out of the rehabilitation facility on a cold, bright afternoon in West Virginia, wearing a yellow jacket and holding onto a physical therapist's arm for balance, and when she came through the doors, Ranger was waiting on the sidewalk. He did not bark, did not run, did not do anything dramatic. He walked to her steadily, the way he always had, and pressed his broad head against her hand, and she held on to him for a long time without saying anything. The people standing nearby said it was very quiet. They said the only sound was the wind off the hills and the faint noise of traffic on the main road, and they said it was one of the most complete silences they had ever heard. In April, the Harrison County Sheriff's Department and the Clarksburg Police Department jointly submitted a letter to the West Virginia Governor's Office commending Ranger's role in the case. He was recognized at a small ceremony in the courthouse rotunda, where a citation was read aloud that described him as having demonstrated extraordinary alerting behavior that directly resulted in the discovery of a living child who would otherwise have remained lost. Carl Hennessy was there, standing to one side, and he said afterward that the citation was accurate as far as it went, but that it left out the most important part, which was that the dog had simply refused to accept what everyone else had already decided was true. He said he thought about that sometimes, on the kind of mornings that make a person wonder what gets missed because no one is paying close enough attention. He said he was glad he had listened. If this story reminded you what loyalty and courage look like, consider subscribing so more stories like this one can find the people who need them.